But more importantly, most excited, just got to spend a bit of time with Juliette Kayyem in the green room, if you will. She is our keynote speaker. Sumedh will be up after that. But with no further ado, I want to welcome Harvard professor, best-selling author, Juliette Kayyem to the stage.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Dino. It's great to see everyone. I want to just begin with thanks to Tammy, Anna, and Richard for having me here and to inviting me, and to, of course, Sumedh. My name is Juliette Kayyem. I'm here to wake you up because I saw you all partying last night and when I got here, and to also talk to you about disaster and crisis management, which is my space, in terms of the disruptions that can happen to yours or any networks. Anyone from Florida who made it out? People, anyone, I'm sure people have family in Florida. We are seeing disruptions impact our infrastructure, and I want to talk to you about ways to think about it and prepare for it. That is the goal at the end of this. You are the cybersecurity experts, but I've been in this field 25 years, and I've learned a lot in terms of preparedness, and the most important word is learning to fail safer. That is what you're going to learn today. I'm going to assume something bad's going to happen, and you're going to come out on the other side better for it. Okay, how did I get here? This is my introduction page, hello, and my book that we're going to talk about a little bit about the lessons in the book. But it all starts here. I have one daughter and two sons. They all were living at home during COVID. Those of you who know New England, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the houses are old and cranky. My house was built in 1840. It's been a gazillion things since the time I bought it in 2010. It has been a single family house, a split house. It was a restaurant. It was a boarding house. And like cranky old New England houses, it's got lots of things that don't make a lot of sense, right? And so you're just told, oh, that's a closet and that's a crawl space. In April, by, of course, March of 2020, I have all three kids back in the house, and the two boys have their own bathroom. This is gonna, the fan breaks in the bathroom. And this is the result. First of all, they don't tell me for 2 weeks, so they're just taking their showers, and then the ceiling collapses. So why am I talking about disasters with a bathroom in which the ceiling collapses? So we stick our head up that ceiling because when we bought the house in 2010, well before, or 2000, actually 2001, well before a pandemic that kept us all inside, we were told that on the third floor, the space above their bathroom, there was a closet, a back of the closet wall, and then a crawl space. No need to look at it. Who goes and looks at a crawl space behind a closet door? This is just the way these houses are built, and there's all sorts of nooks and crannies, and that's what we were told. So this is supposed to be the crawl space. So I crawled in. And the crawl exposes that it's bigger than a crawl space. It's about 10 feet. I don't mean to suggest that there's a room in my house that I didn't notice, but it could fit a bed and certainly space for a person, especially if they were sick. And we go up to this room, or I go up to this room, and this is there's one thing in it. It's a picture left behind. The room was sealed. And this is a picture, and on the back of it, it says Annie something something McHugh, like we can't quite figure it out. So I do what any person with too much time at their house with three kids who wants to like walk out the front door and never return again because we're in the beginnings of COVID, I put it on Twitter. Because remember, Twitter used to be helpful. And there were lots of genealogists and lots of people online. So within like 3 hours, right, the helpful people on Twitter are, first of all, they all figure out where I live, which was like really stupid of me. I was like, oh, this is my house. They're like, yeah, you live at Lee Street, but you're going to see where I live in a second. And they determined, just based on the coloring of the photo and maybe some deciphering Annie, that this must have been to Annie McHugh, who lived in the house from 1917 to 1919, right? This picture must have been, and that this is maybe her father or someone like a Charles McHugh or someone older. And I go, oh, that's so neat. Like, oh, the McHughes lived here. And I'm like, oh, that's so great. And of course, being in disaster management with like terrorism, hurricanes, and oil spills and all the work I've done, I make my husband lock the bathroom door because I'm completely freaked out at this time. I was like, I don't do ghosts. Like, I don't know what happened up there, but something happened up there. I wake up the next morning to the Twitter helpfulness, to something much more eerie and telling. Remember, we're locked in my house. I'm trying to protect my children from COVID. And that is that Tish, Elizabeth Tish McHugh, known as Tish, lived in the house also with her parents. She was the second child. Their first son had died when he was 6. She was the second child of the McHughes, Annie and Charles McHugh, who lived in my home, and was 19 in 1919. She was the greatest, she was her father's, sort of partner in crime. They were known to travel together. The family was very well known. They knew the governor. They were business people. They were very involved with the community. And at some stage that morning, the next morning, we learned that Tish McHugh died in the house in what's called an infirmary room, right, on the 3rd floor. She passed away when she was 19, and further research disclosed on her death certificate that she had died in the 3rd wave of the pandemic that had happened 100 years earlier in the United States, what's known as the Spanish flu pandemic. And there we were 101 years later, another family trying to protect their children from a deadly pandemic. That continuity of my home, the weirdness of it, the freakiness of it. My daughter was 19 at the time. That continuity within my home really struck me, that we can view ourselves as in a unique period of time in which these things are so random and rare. But what if we began to think about disasters and crisis as just being a through line, right? That it's our standard operating procedure now. That wasn't just sort of like this disruption, but that the continuity of my home and all the things that had happened to it since the McHughes moved out in 1919 was sort of that through line that really made me think about my own work. Here I was in Homeland Security and disaster management, advising mayors and governors about how to respond to COVID, teaching students how to be, by Zoom at this house 2 stories below. What was that through line? And this ends up being the sort of purpose of sort of where my work has gone, which is that I can no longer think of these things as random and rare. And what would that mean for the way the disaster and crisis management system got set up? Because it got set up very, very differently than this idea of continuity or recurring disasters. The McHughes move out in 1919 after Tish passes away. They close up the upstairs. They put a back door to a closet, and it was never discovered until my sons, who forgot to tell me that their fan was broken, the ceiling falls apart. That story has now guided me in many ways about thinking about my own career. I'm still in the house. I didn't move out. I survived COVID in the house. And just thinking about that closet, right? And that idea that there is just a family 100 years before experiencing the same thing that we were experiencing at that moment. Okay, so how does it make me think about this? And this talk is going to go through sort of where we were in disaster management, where you are in disaster management and crisis management, what the threat environment looks like to you. I figure you all are the experts in that. And then 3 of the 8 lessons that I give in my book of things that I want you to think about. And how I do this is, look, no one's going to read a book on disaster management, boring, right? What I do is I study disasters from the past, crises from the past, and what can we learn from them to help guide us for the future, right? It's a field of study. This is why, because it turns out that there are common things that link all of these. that you can get ready for now. And that's why you're here, and I know that's why that's the effort that you're going to be exploring in the days ahead. Okay, this is the old system, right? Slide, you call it slide left, slide right, left a boom and right a boom, right? Prevention and protection, right? Locks on the cockpit door, go after the terrorists in Afghanistan, but the thing happens. The boom. And remember, I'm agnostic on the boom. I started off in counterterrorism. I'm an all hazards person now because I couldn't, because like how can you ignore all this stuff? Like cyber, pandemics, whatever. I think about the boom and right a boom, right? Response, immediate response, which you're going to see in the next 48 hours in Florida with Milton. Recovery, which you're going to start to see with Helene in those areas. And then what this generic word, resiliency, right? That world of rainbows and unicorns that we all dream of and no one knows how to get there, right? Okay, this is old. Because this viewed disasters as random and rare. This is the system that we set up, right? You sort of pop up, something bad happens, there, but for the grace of God go I. Poor person lost their house, poor victim lost their house. This community got destroyed. Let's throw them a lot of money because who could have known, right? This is the new system, right? Of course, it's thinking about disaster management as not just not a moment in time, but right as part of a loop of investments that you're making at both the left side of the boom and right side of boom to do what? So this is the way we're thinking about now. Remember, I'm agnostic about the boom, right? I don't know what it's going to be. You may have some sense for your company, some sense about your networks, but I'm going to be agnostic about the boom. What are those investments you can make? Because the investments left of boom are certainly going to help you right a boom and vice versa. Our public policy is not there yet. Our politics are not there yet. The way we think about it is not there yet. But this is likely what you're experiencing, and we're just behind you, right? And the devil never sleeps. Is trying to reconceive of this system. So, what are you in terms of this, right? This infinite loop. So, what is it that we're trying to do, right? Well, one is we're trying to think about risk in a way that is helpful to the most number of people. So many of you all of you are in risk, presumably. You know this chart. What am I worried about, right? And this is how we think about risk and disaster and crisis management, right? I've got my low probability, low consequence, high probability, high consequence. That's a lot of probability and risk that I'm worried about. And we put them into different quadrants, right? Car accidents, high probability, low consequence. Low consequence not maybe for the person who had the car accident, they could be injured, but low consequence overall for society, right? And we have systems that are adapting to this, or not adapt. There are systems that cover this, right? Insurance, permitting. The fact that I keep going back to my sons. I love them dearly, but they cost a lot on insurance, on car insurance, and so it's like, and so just there are systems in place to regularize that first quadrant. The second quadrant that I'm not going to worry about, that likely most of you don't worry about, right? I mean, you're experiencing from a cyber perspective high probability, low consequence all the time, presumably. Lots of stuff is happening, right? And you can sort of deal with it, and you know how to deal with it. This, you're not going to set up your system around the low probability, low consequence event. And these are the selfie stick deaths. And my apologies to anyone who knows anyone that this happened to, but we get a couple dozen deaths a year of people who really want that Instagram picture, right? And apparently the Grand Canyon, they learn the Grand Canyon and gravity aren't a good combination, right? But you're not going to set your security system around this. Maybe you'll put up signs, don't lean over this thing. But you're not so worried about this. It's this that you have to be worried about. And in some ways, it's disrupting our risk calculation, right? So remember, I'm a right of boom person. I'm worried about the crash landing, right? I'm going to assume, I know all sorts of things need to be done left of boom, but I'm going to assume that crash landing. And so then I just think about what are my high consequence events, whether it's what's called the gray rhino, which is, of course, your high probability, high likelihood event, Florida hurricanes, right? I know this is going to happen. It shouldn't be surprise. And gray rhino is a rejoinder to what most of you, the terminology most of you have already heard about the black swan event, right? The high probability, the high consequence, low probability event. Who could have known that would have happened? 9/11, right? That we weren't expecting it. But the consequences tend to be the same, whatever the risk is, whatever your probability is. And that's just a way to think about it. We can get so stuck on thinking about risk silos, right? Does this happen, is this 10%, is this 20%, is this 30%, that we forget that the consequences are likely to be the same. And that's what we can learn from previous disasters. I can't tell you what the fluke is gonna be. Once again, I'm agnostic about the boom. I'm just gonna, who would have thought Helene, right? In areas so far from the coast. But I know what you need at the moment of it, and that's what I wanna discuss in the slides to come. But I didn't want to take a moment just to put your, I like bullets and PowerPoints, bullet points and PowerPoints, but just basically, you know what the threat environment is, right? The three major things that you're facing, of course, are significant data breaches. Already in Wired Magazine, I think I have the link embedded, Wired Magazine said in 2024 already, sort of a 1 billion plus in losses based on these significant data breaches. We know the companies, we know who they are, right? And I'll get a little bit into who the culprits are, but we know what's happening. The second, newer and consequential, is your high-profile supply chain attacks. I mean, we know, this is basically your third-party vulnerability, right? I had never heard of Chance Healthcare before it was hacked, and I had no idea if it's infiltration into our healthcare system. Until it was attacked, right? I mean, who hears that? Who had heard of Colonial Pipeline? I hadn't, right? I knew there's companies like that, but I hadn't. These are so this becomes these high-profile supply chain incidents in which you're dealing with the consequences of a third-party vulnerability, right? And then the third is the increase in ransomware attacks with almost no legal guidance over this. Right, we still don't require companies to disclose, so we're not quite. At a certain level, we're not quite sure what's going on out there. There's there's ransomware insurance because there's sort of a quid pro quo between companies and these nefarious actors, right? We'll pay it off, you keep quiet, you'll go away, and I'll get my system back. But obviously, the ransomware attacks have significant impact in terms of critical infrastructure. I think 2 nights ago I saw, I don't know how much has been disclosed, in terms of our major water supply system is now trying to ward off a significant ransomware attack. Okay, so this is what you're living, right? Okay, who's the culprits? Well, first, I don't want, we talk about all this sort of ickiness out there. I mean, the major culprits are still nation actor states, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about the other culprits, right? I mean, in other words, we know who they are. They're China, Iran, and Russia, right? So this is the attack on sorry about this. This is, I always forget the names. This is Midnight Blizzard, also known as Cozy Bear, that is essentially a wing of Russia's intelligence, right? And remember, look at the trajectory of their attacks went from sort of fun and games in the election with the DNC attack, and that would have been 2016, to solar winds in 2020, to now Microsoft. I mean, so just think about their trajectory in terms of the kind of disruption. They are known by our intelligence agencies as an entity of Russian intelligence. I don't need to create the linkages, and is connected so they're connected directly to the SolarWinds breach. So these characters just come and go, and companies are making calculations about how much they should or should not pay and what their disclosure and liability is if personal information is taken. I am sure a lot of you spend a lot of time with your general counsels at your offices or lawyers, right? Because they are very worried about the liability of your companies if things are exposed that ought not to have been. But it's not just the big nation states. I want to just do a little bit of an aside. Current events are happening, you know it, right? And so So what we're seeing in the systems, this isn't a particular hack, but you can see how it can guide reality, right? This is the rise of the AI-generated fakes, and what they might say about your company, what they might say about your customers, the ways, taking voices of leadership of companies and disclosing information or statements that then become disruptive to the company, right? So a lot of you are dealing with AI as a benefit to your company. In my world, it's a real harm. We haven't figured out, AI has the capacity to make right of boom preparedness and response better, because presumably we'll know where harm is, we'll know where to drive resources. Right now, as a lot of you are reading, it is a lot of noise in the system, right? It is pictures, and what I should say is, so this went viral. This is a child who doesn't actually exist. This made it to the New York Post. It linked. I mean, people are so horrible. I mean, you would think I would know that by now, given my field. It linked to a GoFundMe account, right? So people are seeing this image, and some guy's just making money. I'm sure he's not even close to the area in the lead. And this creates noise in the system, right? So thinking about, you don't have to actually penetrate the wires in cybersecurity. There are things that are just out there now that we just don't know how to manage them right now. And all this talk of better AI and managing the system and stuff, I don't know what to tell you. I wish we were there, but we're not. So we're going to have to figure out ways to deal with the noise. Okay, if that's the case, then why do we get ready for the crash landing? I get ready for it because I measure success by less bad. Right? I don't do good. I mean, so if you think about the world you're in, are you ready if the bad thing happens? I know you spend a lot of time trying to stop that boom or disruption, to make things less bad when they do, right? That's your commonality, right? My standard of success is less bad, right? And someone else can do good, and I hope you're all doing good. But if you don't do good, less bad is something you're going to have to sell. It's a challenge, and I get it. It's a challenge for all of you to sort of convince your companies, convince your leadership that being ready, right, the kinds of things that the reason why you're here, the existence for Quails, right, to be ready, to anticipate the harm, to assess risk rationally. It is a hard sell sometimes, and those of you who are in companies in which you're not, the company's doing something else, and you're sort of you're like friction, right? Security is friction in the system for a lot of these companies, and you got to convince them that it's good friction, right? I mean, look, airport security is friction in the system, right? People just want to get from point A to point B quickly. You got to make the case about good friction, and it's a paradox. And we call it the preparedness paradox in my space for a reason. Why? Because the better you do at this, the harder it is to convince people that your job is worth retaining. Everyone's nodding now. Yes, it is very difficult to do that, right? It's like, well, nothing bad happened, so let me tell you why I'm necessary. Right? And then if the bad thing happens, you get fired. I know, trust me, I'm in the same field, right? Like, it's like nothing, if everything is good, they say, well, she's redundant, and everything is bad, she's fired, right? So, and so it is a preparedness paradox. In some ways, I don't have a perfect answer for you to it, but just to recognize it. And part of the reason why I tell stories about this world, right, in my world, in media and stuff, is because you all, no offense, but we're pretty bad at telling our stories, right? We like the secrecy or like whatever. Like, you need to tell what these investments are about, why products are necessary, how you're using them. Because if they're successful, it's really hard for people to see, right? And knowing that exists, maybe it just will give you a way to think about how am I telling this story. So I want to tell three, right? Okay, So this is basically the breakdown of The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters, right? I took hundreds of years of disasters, and in typical, make it simple, I sort of focused on 8 key takeaways that you can do. I'm going to focus on the first 3 for you at all. I worked with the team here about what you might be interested in. And I tell these stories through previous disasters so you could see, oh, I can see what that investment was. Because we tend to think of disasters only as bad, but actually, there are ways to think of what good came out of them, or there's counter stories. So, and so the overall way to think about this is I'm going to learn, or I'm going to invest in failing safer. All of you know fail-safe systems. That's the world you're in. I'm safer. Right? I know that sounds weird. I'm sort of casual about it, but just, you all know this. Like, a world of safe is like, then we won't have an Olympics, and then we won't be connected. I mean, I know what safe systems look like. I remember after the Boston Marathon bombing, I was the state Homeland Security advisor for Massachusetts, and then moved on to federal government. The next year, reporters asked, well, is the Boston Marathon safe? I was like, you don't just have 26.2 miles, right? You have 52.4, right? No, there's no such thing as safe, right? Is that we're going to make it safer, but if you want to have the kind of society, the kind of companies that you're representing, the kind of networks that are connected, you're just thinking about how do I make investments left of boom that make, if it comes to the boom, I'm assuming it does, that lower the consequences, that minimize the consequences. So I always think in terms of failing safer, not safe. Though I dream of that, right? I dream of that world. Okay, so what are some of these lessons? I want to tell 3 sort of stories that sort of guided me in terms of some of the lessons learned out of the book. The first is, of course, the sort of conceptualizing that you will be right of boom, and what does that look like? Okay, and the best lesson for this is Fukushima. Has anyone heard of Narragansett? Maybe a few of you. Narragansett is about 30 kilometers from Fukushima, closer to the water. More hurt. Remember, everyone remembers that this is, this is the 2011. You had the tsunami. You had the earthquake, to the tsunami, to the nuclear radiation melting in Fukushima. So it's like a 3-part disaster for Japan, right? Okay, so Fukushima and Narragansett are 2 nuclear facilities, not 30 kilometers apart. We know Fukushima. So part of this is what happened at Fukushima. Fukushima was an industry, the nuclear industry was built in Japan under the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right, of the nuclear attacks there. And when Japan realized it needed domestic sources of energy and really invested in nuclear, it had to sell it to its people. And it kind of lied. Right? It sort of convinced the people and the industry, coordinated with the industry, to really think that they could stay left of boom. So all the regulations that exist here in the United States, evacuation zones, all that stuff, just, what do you do in that moment of pressure, are not tested and trained. So the crash landing is coming in. You know the tsunami's coming, right? The airplane's coming in for the crash landing. And the guys, they were all guys, at Fukushima are what? One, they don't have any training. They also, because disaster management is very culturally specific, and there's chain of command that's respected in Japan, they're calling up and up and up and up. To one stage, while the water's rushing in, they're on the phone call with the Prime Minister's office in Tokyo. Not helpful in a crisis, right? I mean, in other words, your runway is short, as they say. Your runway is short, be ready now, right? So part of this is cultural, part of this is historic, and part of it is just not conceptualizing what would you want to do in your short runway. Go forward to Narragansett, right? Or go next door to Narragansett. It happened to be that its owner wasn't owned by the major company in Japan. Happens to be that its owner was trained in the United States, where we have a love-hate relationship with the nuclear industry here, but it is focused on safety and security after 3 Mile Island. He's trained, he understands what it means to empower your people to respond in real time and anticipate the boom. That's all of your jobs now. They know what they're seeing. They don't ask for permission. And this is, anyone who knows nuclear energy is going to cry when I say this. And they unplugged the system. I know it's not unplugging, but they did something right? So in my world of less bad, right, in failing safer, earthquake destroys, both nuclear facilities are still down. They're decommissioned, right? So they are in bad shape. Both hit by an earthquake, both overwhelmed by a tsunami, radiation leak, no radiation leak. I'm taking the less bad one, right? And so that's the way to think about what do your teams know? And we never tell the story of what went right? We all know, and then remember, this becomes a huge story about whether nuclear energy is safe. Honestly, it is, if you know that it's not. Right? If you know that you have to invest in empowering your people to be able to respond. So just always think about your short runway. That's the difference between a crisis and every other problem that we have, right? Your runway is short. A second takeaway from these stories that I spend a lot of time studying is situational awareness, right? So those of you who know this, so when I say you can build it now, you can build it now. Right, what you want at the crash landing, right? Are you going to be able to figure out in real time what is happening, be able to manage that and relate it to leadership or whomever in real time, and will it be understood? And I'm going to talk a little bit about hurricane numbers in a second on this. So this is one of my favorite examples of interesting situational awareness. Those of you, I know some of you came up from San Francisco. Lots of controversy about the present mayor, London Breed. I won't get into that. What I will say is she was the first mayor to close down an American city in 2020, back to COVID, but this is for a different reason. Why? So it turned, why was she first? The federal government was saying this, the WHO wasn't saying shut down. She's the first. So she had very interesting situational awareness. In other words, you can have formal processes, but make sure that those formal processes aren't tying you to what reality is telling you. San Francisco holds the largest non-Asian country Lunar New Year celebration in the world. And their party is late February 2020. And the mayor goes out and she looks around, and I'm quoting her, so I apologize, but it gets to you. She said it was only white people. Right? There was no one from the Asian community was out for that Lunar New Year. So she knows that community knows something that she's not hearing from all the data she's getting from her public health official. What is it? So when I say situational awareness can be formal, it can also be informal. So she deploys her community outreach teams. And to a T, every family that didn't show up, every person who didn't show up says, oh, I have family in China. This thing is, 1, deadly, 2, respiratory, 3, we shouldn't be going to mass events. They knew. And so she shuts down. It's just that that's a way of thinking about, am I too tied to the ways I'm receiving information? But now I want to talk about communicating it out. Because we're talking a lot about that in disaster management today, right? We are taught, and when I think about the metrics that you're using, you have numbers and stuff like that, you should really be thinking about, is this relating what the consequences are, right? Because your numbers can give you a sense of risk, but the consequences may be different. Category 5 gets you nervous. Right, Category 5 hurricane, and we know Milton's going back and forth. It will probably hit as a Category 3, we think. Hurricane Katrina, Category 3, right? And we think, everyone sort of in their head says Category 5. Category 3 when it hit land. Because the category is not relating what the consequences could be. And what we're going to see in Milton is, I could care less what the category it is why the weather people are going nuts. I'm worried about the storm surge. Right? So I don't have an answer for this in real time, but everyone is thinking about now whether the systems we had in place before are communicating the consequences of what could happen. The storm surge is going to be crazy. in Florida. I don't care what the category is. And I only relate that is when you're thinking about your preparation for the boom, right? And the awareness that you have. One, is it still satisfactory? Are you testing it? And is it relating to leadership and whoever else, what the potential consequences could be? And then that gets to my third example. And often the answer is no, right? Colonial Pipeline, a lot of you know this story certainly because it's in your world, but Colonial Pipeline is a story that reminds us that our architecture matters, right? Safety and security is ultimately an architectural issue. Who is doing what? Who are they reporting to? And are those things in unity of effort? Colonial Pipeline is a perfect example, and the company didn't do anything wrong. I mean, it was a stupid ransomware attack, and one could argue whether they should have paid it, but they get hit, right, people remember this, by a ransomware attack. This is in the early days of the Biden administration. They pay it off. They don't tell anyone. The payoff works. They're supposed to get the patch. The patch does not work. Colonial Pipeline is distributing close to 50% is managing close to 50% of the pipeline that distributes oil and gas to the East Coast. Now you've got a problem. Because their fear is, of course, that they're going to pump blind. I don't know much about pumping oil, but I know you kind of would want to know what was in the pipelines. And so they only have one right of boom, one crash landing option, because they haven't thought through, right, a variety of plausible scenarios. They haven't thought through what is it that could happen. And why is that? Because their architecture was horrible. Thinking about who you would need as you go through your plausible scenarios. I know cyber can, a lot of people will treat you as distinct. Your job in a lot of your companies is to not be, right? We're sort of, I mean, I did it too. I was having problems uploading something. I was like, where's the computer guy, right? Like, it's like, you know, you have some super squirrely skill, right? That lots of people are sort of afraid of in some ways or in awe of. Your job is to make sure it's related to every plausible scenario that could happen. As I prepare you for, right, what the risk is and what the management of the problem is. So I always urge, look at your architecture. So what Colonial Pipeline did is what any rational company would do, which is they're setting up their response around what the risk could be. They were worried about a cyber risk, and they're worried about a physical risk. So over here they have the CISO. Over there they have the chief security officer. He's worried about pipelines and graffiti and you know, mayhem on the pipelines, right? The physical stuff. Never did the two meet. I mean, they met, but you know what I mean. In other words, their response was not tied. So when you have a problem on the network, you got a problem on the pipeline, right? And it's that sort of totality of thinking about sort of, you know, your preparedness, your enterprise risk and capacity. You got to make sure your architecture is right. They fixed it. Right, but if we're thinking too much in silos, I've got what we call the guys, you know, the guards, gates, and guns, right? Those are the physical teams. You've got the CISOs, right? The people who are thinking about information protection. Now a lot of companies have some of your companies may have public health people, right? If you're in, you know, supply chain, you're worried about what's going on in the world. Some now have resiliency or climate risk assessors, right? Because if you're worried about, you know, your properties or whatever else. That's a lot of different, honestly, chiefs, all looking at different risks. But when the boom happens, the needs are the same. You want to minimize the harm, have situational awareness, be prepared for action at the operational level, make sure you don't have single points of failures, all the things that we know we need to do in preparedness. So these are some of the lessons. Oh my gosh, 2 minutes left. I'm coming to the end. These are some of the lessons that guide people like me when we think about the recurring nature of disasters, right? That your investments, or let me put it a different way, building at shift left, right? My infinity story, building left a boom is going to help you fail safer right a boom. Because you've got to assume that the crash landing's coming and your runway is short, right? So you got to be ready, or you got to find ways to extend the runway. Those are your only options. and that is the connectivity of the McHughes on the top floor in the pandemic 101 years ago to today. It's not rocket science. There's nothing new about it. And that should be, in some ways, give us agency to deal with the world that we are facing, whatever the harm can be. Okay, so I want to end with just sort of your takeaways from this. There are lots of different issues, and I can leave my slides. I see people taking pictures, not a big deal. So sort of, one is, where are you? Sort of the Fukushima lesson, right? Are we, and I don't mean it like, well-beingness. I just mean like, are you prepared for the boom, and what will be required of you down, across, and up? Up is important when the boom comes. A lot of you work for companies, I don't mean this in, a lot of you are working in companies in which, the leadership may not get you in many ways, or may have so much confidence in you. But if something bad happens, they're not calling you in many instances, or they're calling you, guess who else they're calling? Their lawyer, and they're calling their marketing team. I mean, their marketing PR team. You got to get a seat at the table, right? So where are you, and are you placed, right? The second is, what is your resiliency architecture? I want you to really think about this in terms of, you can't change all the pieces of a company or where you are, but just to really think about, are we too risk focused? What are the commonalities when the crash landing comes and we can work together? What are my potential consequences that fall outside of my ambit, right, that might impact the colonial pipeline, right, and thinking those through. And then what is the distribution of money? It's I can't, the money thing is very difficult in the sense, like, I just don't know what numbers you're talking about, but we think about it. I mean, why you're here is we think about it: rules, tools, people, and processes, right? That's why you're here. It's the systems that exist, the tools, right, that you acquire, that you are using, that are helping to minimize the harm, the people, all of you, right? And then how you fit into the processes. And that's why the work that you all are doing, the Quails is doing, is consistent with a world in which I think about hurricanes, plane crashes, and everything else, right? It's the same. And hopefully that will empower you to think about your role not just as, a sliver of what it is, but as part of an overall enterprise to reduce the risk, right, and be ready to fail safer. Okay? So that's it. Unbelievable. See, 4 seconds left. Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliette.